Okay, other things, long-standing trauma such as physical abuse, neglect, war. Things that happen over a long period of time. Okay, they are, by definition, chronic. Our support structure may be there, but they're often going through it with us. We can see the difference between acute and chronic here. They can often be cumulative, though. Okay, our brains start to wire themselves in a way that they basically are there for fight, flight, or freeze. They are there to protect us. They are there for survival. Okay, we're not thinking about the cognitive aspect of what's going to go on next. We're thinking about, I need to live. I need to get through today. Am I going to be able to put my head on a pillow tonight? Am I going to get a meal this evening? Is this person going to or not going to hurt me? What do I need to do to survive? That's chronic.
And our last type of trauma is complex trauma. And this is without question relevant to so many of the kids we have in dependency, because this happens in the early years. And this is the hardest kind of trauma to treat, because it's at the core of that time, that biological gift of brain development. So basically 0 to 4, right? That's about 80% of the brain architecture is occurring 0 to 4. Most important year of your life is year 1. So your source of terror, your source of pain is your caregiver, your primary caregivers. So, how do kids respond to traumatic events? It's really based on the quality of their attachment system, their attachment relationships. So when you have a parent that's frightened or frightening, or they only respond to distress, there's neglect, that's what we see in complex trauma, and it has a massive impact on every area of a child's brain. So you'll see a suppressed prefrontal cortex. You could see increased volume of the amygdala. It just, it affects your hippocampus. So, all these parts of the brain are deeply impacted in complex trauma. And, the earlier we can get to kids, the better our outcomes, because it takes far less energy and time to change the brain in the early years than it will when you're like the kids I worked with that were 15, 16, 17 years old. It takes tremendous time and energy to change the brain. So complex trauma, again, profound effects on nearly every aspect of a child's development and functioning. Any questions? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is complex trauma in the DSM-5?
Oh,
Basically,
good question.
Underdiagnosed.
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely underdiagnosed. Basically, what we're talking about here is a style of trauma. The type of trauma this is basically, this is the most pervasive type. It's the type of, basically the rug is swept out from these kids, This is the trauma that the very people that are there to care for this child are often the ones that are causing this trauma. So it's not something that is like diagnosed or diagnosable, but it is part of a more in-depth trauma, like in PTSD. It's not saying this is PTSD complex type. It is part of PTSD. You should be up here with us. We're going to show you a PET scan later on that talks about trauma. It depends on what types of therapeutic intervention and support the child has with. Pardon? Then yeah, you'll probably be able to see it. Yeah, there's a term called neuroplasticity, where with intervention, with support, with love that is, often provided from therapeutic intervention, from people such as guardians at Litem, caregivers, etc. A child, anyone, has the ability to regenerate the neural pathways of the brain. Without that, yeah, you're gonna definitely see issues in the brain. Absolutely.
Those are great questions. And to go back to your question, sir, there, in my opinion, and I'm not a clinician, but I'm a massive fan of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. We actually had a diagnosis of developmental trauma disorder, which was presented to be in the DSM-5, and it was rejected. And many of the top clinicians, psychiatrists around the country were just irate. They could not believe we couldn't get this diagnosis of a developmental trauma disorder, because complex trauma is also called developmental trauma. But they're very hopeful that diagnosis will make the next DSM, because that would get away from all the labels. Our kids with complex trauma, you're talking 3 to 8 comorbid diagnoses, where if they had a diagnosis of developmental trauma disorder, you'd have one label, one diagnosis. And Chad, you're absolutely right. What's going to change the brains of kids with developmental trauma is going to be thousands and tens of thousands of interactions with high quality caregivers. It's kind of like reparenting. So, new experiences and the absence of danger, that's what's really going to promote healing. So the more you get these new experiences, the more, you've heard this before, those neurons start to fire. The more they fire, those neurons, they start to wire. They wire together, now they survive together, now they thrive together. And you're changing the brain through the way we act, the way we behave, and using the framework of trauma-informed care. Great questions. Other ongoing sources of stress.
Okay, before we even go through these, okay, I want you to think about the kids and families with whom you've worked. Okay? Think of what they have gone through. Think of their histories, think of their lives. Think of who they are, what they've experienced. We're going to go through these relatively quickly because I, believe it or not, know that we ramble on a little bit. And we do want to try to get through as many of our slides as possible. And I did just look at my phone and my clock on the phone. So you don't need to raise your hand, but think of what these families have experienced. Poverty. Go on.
The greatest crime on the planet.
Yep. Discrimination.
Validated. A lot of our kids expect the worst outcomes.
Separation from parent or siblings.
Each removal takes you back to that first one.
Frequent moves. Okay, every single move, from the very first one to the very last one, is traumatizing. It is re-traumatizing. Little example for you. Okay, imagine, since you guys are at a conference, hopefully you guys are all here tomorrow as well, and then there's the weekend coming up, so you won't be in your offices. Imagine you show up to work on Monday. All your work stuff is packed in a garbage bag. Sound familiar? What our kids often have their stuff packed in? Garbage bag, because they don't often have suitcases. Okay, you are told by your supervisor or boss, hey, we have a new job for you. This new office is going to love you. You're going to love it at this new place. This person's going to drive you there today because, you didn't get along with your coworkers, brothers and sisters. And it's the whole way across the state. You're going to have a new career, new home. And you're going to have new brothers and sisters, coworkers. You also aren't going to have your current job either because, well, it didn't work out. Is anyone here a plumber? You're all going to be plumbers. Okay? You don't have any experience being a plumber, but hey, that's your new job. And you're going to need to know all the rules of being a plumber on Monday, because that's what they do there. That family's, office is plumbers. And you make sure you know all the rules there. Don't worry, they're great people. You're going to love them. They're going to love you. And all the people that are here at your current job, you probably never see them again. This is going to happen maybe 5 times this year. Now, all of you are adults in here. You think that's preposterous, Chad. My name's Chad, for those of you that are wondering. Think about what happens to our kids. All of you are adults. You all have coping skills. You all have life experience. You're like, okay, I might be able to make this happen, maybe. I don't know, plumbing might be an awful job, but I could probably pull it off. 5 times a year for some of these kids to move. They don't have the coping skills. They don't have the original attachments often. But they bounce from home to home to home to home. And we tell them that this new place is going to be fantastic. That these people are going to love them. That this place is going to be awesome. That this person that's driving them, that they've probably never met before, you can trust this very new stranger drive you across the state. You're going to have all brand new friends that you've never met before. These frequent moves are incredibly traumatizing. Imagine leaving your family that often, having to do that as an adult. And we're telling our kids that this is an okay thing, that this is good.
And attachment always trumps trauma, by the way. Kids are fundamentally conditioned to love their parents.
And you wonder why they might have school problems. Let's have all this going on and then say, do math. It's not going to happen as easily as we hope it will.
Stressed brains don't learn.
Okay, and traumatic grief and loss. Okay, all this that I just talked about is traumatic grief and loss. Let's compound that with the fact that I can't talk. Or, okay, the initial grief of loss of family, loss of this past family, loss of friends, loss of the relationship with a teacher, loss of being maybe really close to a breakthrough with your past therapist, loss of friends, loss of things you enjoyed in the environment, happening over and over and over again. And then we tell them, hey, attach, be loving, be happy. This is a great thing, right? One that we don't experience a whole lot in this part of the country, but it does happen. Okay, refugee or immigrant experiences. This is a big part of ongoing stress.
And, with that, I serve South Florida, so, Broward, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, obviously there's a lot of refugee immigrant experiences, as there is, in many demographics. But keeping in mind that we all need cultural humility, because that's going to play a big role in how people ask for help, how they communicate, how they seek services, their view of the world, their perspective. So the cultural humility is about, staying out of judgment. It's about, you don't know what you don't know. Expect to be wrong. Expect to be surprised. And expect to need to ask someone for help, a guide from that culture, because it's going to play a massive role.
So some of the long-term effects. You can go ahead and click. Okay. How do these people learn to cope? Okay. Often alcoholism. Okay. Drug abuse, depression, suicide attempts, STDs due to high-risk activities with multiple partners. Okay. This is pervasive throughout these populations. Heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, skeletal issues, liver disease, Shorter lifespan. What's this sounding really similar to? It rhymes with faces without the F. The ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. All these things that are traumatic experiences are adverse childhood experiences. They are going to most likely shorten the lifespan of our children if we don't address them soon, if we don't address them quickly, if we don't address them pervasively.
Yeah, it certainly is going to play out decades later, and the ACE study is certainly from a public health standpoint.
So, tying it together, the long-term trauma impact tied to the ACE pyramid, and this is from the CDC. Okay, from conception, for those of you that can't read it in the back, okay, we have adverse childhood experiences. And just like Graham was talking about, what happens is we have disrupted neurodevelopment. Okay, our brains, neurodevelopment is basically stunted because what's happening is our brains work towards survival. Okay, our brain's wiring basically doesn't go to the higher portions of the brain for higher cognition, for language development, for reasoning skills. No, it's survival mode only. Primitive neural activity, which is going on in my head right now.
Chad, let me pose a question. Yeah. What do you all think? Is the brain development more about your genetics and your temperament, or is it more about your experiences? It's way more about your experiences. And it's the right experiences at the right times in life. And that's that biological gift of brain development, particularly 0 to 4, 0 to 1, most importantly.
Without question. So, as these children's brains are not developing at a normal pace, what happens? There's a much higher probability that there's social issues, that there's going to be social issues, emotional issues, and cognitive impairment. Okay? Don't need to show of hands. How many of our kids are socially behind, are emotionally behind, are cognitively behind? Okay? This is becoming a fact. It's you all can see it with the kids with whom you work. Okay, from there, what do our kids do? They start to utilize various types of coping skills that they feel are going to help them. What are those coping skills? Health risk behaviors, okay? That's our smoking, our drug use, our risky sexual behaviors. Why? Because they get a response here, now. If it feels good, do it. We don't think of the consequences to those behaviors. When we do that, what's that going to lead to? It's going to lead to diseases, disabilities. It's going to lead to social problems. Okay, we got to get money for the drugs somehow. We're not going to be able to maintain a job. All these things are going to eventually lead to early death. And that's how that ties in. So if we don't address these issues early, if we don't address the impacts of trauma early, we run a very high probability of this for our kids.
You know, and you think about a lot of the behaviors of our kids, you know, people see them as being oppositional, but when you have this lens, you see them as a child in distress, and you understand the motives behind their behavior. The dose-response effect of ACEs, right? You know, an ACE score of 4 or more, from a public health standpoint, poverty starts to become an outcome. With an ACE score of 6 or more, that adversity package, 6 or more has taken 20 years off the lifespan from a public health standpoint. So it's so critical that we invest on the front end. And it's just imperative we embrace this science, and that's what it is. It's science, and science is facts. you know, real quickly, because I know we're going to run out of time here shortly, but the model for intergenerational transmission of child maltreatment, you know, this gets passed on. You know, how many of you are parents? Grandparents, right? How did you learn how to be a parent? Yeah. But we generally, we follow these parenting roadmaps based on how we were parented. You know, and if you know, if you have some parenting roadmaps that were really unhealthy and you don't have the self-awareness, you're going to carry that on. Just like we have relational blueprints, you know. A lot of our kids, they're going to pass on how they were parented. They're going to pass on these relational blueprints. So it's so important that we have these interactions with them and show them new ways, new experiences, new ways of being in relationships, what to expect from them, how to do them, how to repair them. But, you know, we can't have this child who's in care, you know, who then has, you know, we kind of walk through a lot of these talking points, you know, the school problems, you know, symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, aggression, adolescence, you know, the substance abuse. Because, listen, kids are vulnerable and dependent by nature, and they are really vulnerable to anything that provides relief. And that's what drugs, street drugs and alcohol do for a lot of our kids. That's what, you know, smoking the psychoactive agents that are in our cigarettes, they provide relief. You know, so this great adversity is going to come with some coping, okay? You're gonna find some relief, you know, and society is going to look at it as maladaptive, but for you it's very adaptive, you know? So these are functional aspects, as dysfunctional as they sound, right? The local drug dealer, the local bartender, or the local pharmacologist, you know, you get into adulthood, you find out your ways of dealing with things, you know, you follow that cycle, you know, poverty, maternal depression, domestic violence, parenting problems, another child is born, and we carry on these cycles, okay? So, you know, if a parent is parenting with a disorganized attachment style, they got that from their parents, and they're going to pass it on to that child. And we have to break these cycles. I mean, how many of you are working with kids that one of their parents was in foster care or had spent time in the dependency system? Absolutely, yeah.
And with this, you can see the stars at the top and the bottom that say child abuse. We could very well change those stars to say trauma. And the whole cycle works the exact same way.
Nothing more costly to society than child abuse. Preventing ACEs is the single most preventable cause of mental illness, and ACEs are what drives substance abuse, hands down.
So some of the effects of trauma exposure, we're going to go through these really quickly because you all know what these definitions are, so we're not going to read off the definitions to you. Okay, attachment issues.
Seeking safety, unconditional.
Biology. Mood issues. These kids are going to have mood issues. By a show of hands, how many people have never had a bad day? You've never had a bad day? Oh, I was like, wow, I want to hang out with you more often. Okay, well, okay, let's think about this, okay? How many of our kids have never had a bad day? Okay, our kids have bad days, yet in the school system, in the foster care system, okay, I'll even take that back. Whether or not in the foster care system, in the school system, no matter where our kids are, we're expecting our kids to be wonderful 24/7. If not, they get punished. If we have a bad day, it's husband, wife, whomever, leave me alone. And if you don't, you're going to sleep on the couch. Okay? If our foster kid tells you, you're going to sleep on the couch, you know what? We're going to laugh at them and they're going to get grounded or they don't get their sticker for the day, or they get punished some way, shape, or form. Why is it okay for us to have a bad day, but our kids can't? Same thing in schools. If our kid has a bad day, they get written up, they get detention, they get a note sent home, and we as foster parents or caregivers or whatever, okay, grandparents, whomever, these kids get punished. We got to think of some normalcy sometimes. It's okay to have a bad day from time to time.
You know, behavior-based parenting is always defeated by trauma triggers. And, you know, anyone that thinks they can discipline a kid out of their trauma is going to spin in a wheel, and they're going to burn out real quick. They're not going to understand that many of our kids have developed misguided trust, misplaced trust, I like to use the term block trust that the great Dan Hughes has coined. And block trust is when children block the pain of rejection and the capacity to delight us in order to survive in a world without comfort and joy. So when you don't understand block trust, you get frustrated, you start to feel helpless, you're in this one-way relationship. It leads to block care, and we just can't have that. You know, when people get blocked care, that's when they say, we want to put in a 30-day notice. We can't manage this anymore. I mean, there are times, believe me, I've been there, there's a higher level of care is needed, but a lot of times when we don't understand that block trust, it leads to blocked care. So I had a couple notes, Chad, I'm going to read real quick from Kim Golding, who's done tremendous work in the UK on attachment. And she says, you know, with no experience of love in the early years, the child develops fear and doubt instead of trust and hope. You develop fear and doubt instead of trust and hope, which is what you would develop if you had a parent with a secure attachment style. Your social monitoring system is hyper alert. Your social defense system is active. And your social engagement system is inactive. So think about all of our kids that are under-socialized.
Next up, we have dissociation. These are kids that push their emotions away as if they're observing them. That way they don't even have to address them, as if they're not even there.
I like to call it psychological flight. It's like an emotional disappearing act.
Next up, behavioral control. A lot of these kids haven't had the ability to be in control or don't know how to be in control. They are looking to us to establish control. Remember, these kids are sponges. They are watching us 24/7. They're watching how we react. They're watching how their foster parents react, how their caregivers react. If we fly off the handle, guess what they learn to do? They will fly off the handle. And when they bounce from home to home to home, guess what they feel is normal? Being rejected.
They expect to be rejected. Mm-hmm. They expect to be re-victimized. They see horrible outcomes. And, you know, going back to Chad's point, you know, the way the brain is built on experiences. So kids learn how to self-regulate. They learn how to do that by anticipating their caregiver's response to them.
Next up, cognition. How many of our kids have difficulty completing tasks, staying focused? These are our kids. Self-concept. If you're rejected over and over and over again, are you going to think, hey, I'm doing great, life's good? These kids have a difficult time with their own self-concept, self-esteem, self-efficacy. A lot of them are really, really hurting.
And that's why we have to really find something beautiful in every kid we work with. You know, see that strength in them and help them become competent in something. Because, you know, one of the greatest defenses against the helplessness of trauma is competency. So, you know, what are our kids good at? What do they have a passion or a talent for? How can we get them involved in something? How can we get them affiliated with something? You know, maybe they can join a club, a group, a team, contribute to something bigger than themselves, because, you know, competency leads to mastery. And, you know, we have to build that sense of self, that sense of agency, sense of self-efficacy. It's critical.
Finally is development. A lot of our kids are very developmentally behind.
So traumatic stress is the physical and emotional responses to threatening situations. They overwhelm you. Again, you know, it's in the body so much. You know, the body's the container. This kind of energy can get trapped in your nervous system. So there's a lot of physiological arousal. Whoops. I'm going to fly through this one a little bit, but these are some post-traumatic stress reactions. You know, avoidance. You know, avoidance behavior. You're always on edge. You're hyper vigilant, hyper arousal. It's kind of like you have safety blindness, if you would. You know, not able to trust others, hence the term block trust, right? So, you know, one of the things everyone has to understand is, look, we're not going to save the kids we work with. We're not going to fix them. We're going to have little to no impact until we develop trust. And that's what our system never has for our kids, is the time. You know how much time is required to build trust with somebody? We got to put in the time. And we got to have caregivers that are willing to put in that time and embrace this framework. So sense of personal safety, not feeling safe. If you don't feel safe, you can't possibly feel emotionally safe or psychologically safe. You just can't have it without first establishing physical safety. And that's always got to be, one of the priorities, when kids move or, they change placements. Like, let's just get them to feel safe first, before we get anywhere else. Hard time navigating life changes. Okay? So again, this is an individual response. It's about the uniqueness of the individual and their perception of themselves, the world, caregivers. Okay?
I don't know why that clicked backwards. That
Yeah.
was kind of cool.
So we had an audio problem, as you could tell in the beginning. For whatever reason, the audio wasn't connecting. I don't know if it's a cord, it's out of our hands. This is a great video from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. So this is something you can just punch into YouTube, The Science of Neglect. We were hoping to show this to you today. It's about 5 minutes long. We actually brought a handout that comes with this video from the Center on the Developing Child. It's so important we understand neglect, because that is the most common reason our kids are coming into care. National Child Traumatic Stress Network is going to tell you it's over 75% of our cases. So that's your needs are pervasively not being met. Okay? It's that inconsistency. So that's why so much of the care our kids need is about consistency and predictability and routine and structure and engaging that social engagement system and just being delighted by their presence, when kids feel that, when they feel like, man, you're delighted by my presence, they get a little squirt of this neurochemical called oxytocin. You get a little squirt of that. So it's just, it's about really that social engagement system is the good care our kids need. So that's something I encourage you to look at. And we're going to have a handout on neglect and a handout on the impact of complex trauma for you when you walk out. You can grab one on the way out there.
So your question back there earlier, got a picture for you. Okay, this is a picture of a PET scan, PET scan, positron emissions tomography. These are two children, same age. Okay, basically what this is showing is PET scan of a healthy brain versus the PET scan of an abused brain. 3-year-old children, for those of you that can get want a visual of how this is being shown, okay, imagine me going like this, all right? This is me looking up, okay? Back of my head, well, back of the 3-year-old's head is much bigger than my head. Okay, right here is the brain stem. This would be the front of the head. So imagine the person's eyes would be here, nose would be right here. What this is showing is electrical impulses going through the brain. Okay, the primitive portions of the brain, as in the brain stem, fight, flight, freeze, survival mode, happening right here. So your spinal column will be going down here. Brain stem right here. Oh, check it out. Like a cat. Okay. I have a 3-year-old. That laser beam he's just like a cat. He'll chase that thing around for hours. But you can see right in here, this is the healthy brain. There is a lot of neural activity going on. But in the healthy brain, in the temporal lobe, okay, that's an area of the brain where there's a lot more cognitive functioning going on, higher cognitive functioning, okay, reasoning skills, verbal skills, emotional skills, okay, skills that are associated with, again, higher functioning. You can see the electrical impulses are a lot more prevalent. The more color, more prevalent. This is a 3-year-old child who lived in a Romanian orphanage and had been neglected since birth. Tons of neural activity going on in the survival portion of the brain because this child needed to be able to survive. The brain rewired itself for survival mode only. In the higher functioning areas of the brain, there is little to no activity at all because the brain realized it doesn't have a need for it. Pervasively down here, the brain rewired itself for this child to survive, and that's all the brain needed. What is that telling us about neural activity?
The brain's built on experience. And before I go to the next slide, real quickly, there's something lodged in your temporal lobes called the amygdala. It's like the shape of an almond. And the amygdala is like the epicenter of trauma. It's part of your unconsciousness. It's online at birth. All senses come through the amygdala. And the amygdala creates memories and associations. So if your memory is driven by your amygdala, you're going to relive it. You're gonna go back to the then and there. You're not going to be in the here and now anymore. And that's why, we come from a place of neuroscience. We have to find ways to calm our kids' amygdalas because they're literally, for many of our kids, they're on fire. Their nervous system has been changed, to survive in toxic stress. It's changed their whole baseline state of arousal, and that amygdala can even be enlarged. Okay, so you can have a smaller prefrontal cortex and increased volume of the amygdala. And it's really, that epicenter of trauma. And believe it or not, it even works while you're sleeping.
So next up, what is psychological safety? What does safety mean to you? You don't have to answer because we'll be here. Hey, what's safety to you? How about you? How about you? How about you? Okay, something that a lot of foster parents do, and God bless foster parents for what they do. It's an amazing thing. God bless you for what you do. But a mistake that we often make is a traumatized child comes to our homes, and what do? Hey, welcome, you're safe. Our home is a safe place. Come here. Would you like a hug? Come, you're safe here. That's the exact same thing as me and my wife being in an argument and me saying, hey, you're overreacting, calm down. I can see the expression on people's faces, geez, Chad. Talk about sleeping on the couch. Okay, safety is what we feel it is. Safety is our own individual experience. It's not what others tell us it's going to be. It's when we feel comfortable. It's an individual thing. It's just like our hairstyle, or lack thereof. It's what we feel comfortable with. What's it look like? What I feel it looks like. What this person feels it looks like. What this person feels it looks like. Psychologically, it's completely subjective. How can you tell if one of your kids feels safe? Ask. What do we so rarely do? We tell them, hey, you're safe here. No. Ask them, what does safety look like to you? How will I know as a guardian at Litem, as a foster parent, as a therapist, as a teacher, how will I know when you feel safe? It's an easy and an important question, but it's so often overlooked. How can you tell if someone feels unsafe? Well, we have our nonverbals. We have, the shaking, the running away, a lot of the behaviors a lot of our kids do. A lot of the things that we think are the negative behaviors, the attention-seeking behaviors. If you guys can get that term out of your heads, that would be awesome. Trying to get rid of attention-seeking behaviors and replace it with What, Graham? Instead of attention-seeking behaviors, how about relationship-seeking behaviors? These kids are seeking a type of relationship.
Seeking safety.
They're seeking safety, absolutely. They're seeking, okay, even if they're acting out in a way that is just annoying the you-know-what out of you, they're seeking a relationship. They're seeking something that they didn't have before. A response, a relationship. They're seeking support in some way, shape, or form.
So, when you think of relational poverty, it requires relational repair. When you think of attachment, it's seeking safety, seeking appeasement. When you think of a lot of the disturbing behaviors that we see, go back to how did they start out? These were frustrated attempts to communicate distress. These were misguided attempts to survive. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Well, I think, I worked with teenage boys primarily for 20 years, and, it still would come back to, can they attach to one of us? It just takes one of us. Can I build some level of trust? Do they start to value my opinions and my beliefs? So, I'm not going to jump all into it, but, attachment would be the first place to start, and then working on self-regulation. It's one of the true skills that we have to have, if we're going to survive in society. If we're going to, listen, kids are going to grow up, they're going to go back to their communities where they're from. So self-regulation are they able to manage their arousal physically and emotionally? Are we able to teach them pro-social behaviors and different ways of doing things? So it's all about relational repair. Of course, affiliation's another big piece, right? We get kids to be a part of something. Like, I'm not in the dependency system. I'm part of this team. I'm part of this club. I'm part of this group. I contribute to something greater than myself. Through that, they learn attunement, tolerance, and respect. One of the 4 qualities that we all got to have working with kids, whether they're 14 or 4, is something that fuels attachment. It's called the PACE model by Dan Hughes out of the great state of Pennsylvania. It all starts with your playfulness. That's that adult that's open, engaged, relaxed, connected. Acceptance, unconditional, right? Curiosity, being curious about their behaviors. And the last is E, empathy. The PACE model. This is what fuels attachment. Attachment is what makes things better. But I would certainly say it's going to take more time and energy with a 14-year-old, but it can certainly be done. There is always hope for healing, and that prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed to around age 25, 27. So there was, without question, hope for healing with it from coming from a background of abuse, neglect, abandonment. Yeah. Great question.
Okay, some individuals who have experienced trauma, okay, this is kind of simplistic. We're going to go through this relatively quickly. Okay. These people who've experienced trauma, they have valid fears about their own safety and safety of loved ones. Why? Because they've experienced trauma. They've experienced what it's like to be unsafe. They have difficulty trusting others to protect them because often those that have been there to protect them have been the very ones that have harmed them. They may be hyper-aware of potential threats because they've had to be. Being hyper-aware of those potential threats has kept them safe. And they've had problems controlling their reactions to perceived threats because by doing so, they have kept themselves away from perceived threats. All these things have been what has helped them survive. And often this is what we see as troubling behaviors. Okay, these things we look at as problematic, they look at it as, this is how I've survived. Maybe we need to rethink what these behaviors are and why they're doing them.
Right. The maladaptive is adaptive. I'm going to jump through a couple slides here because, Chad, I want to make sure we get to the slide. We have about 5 minutes that as at Guardian Litems, they can certainly ask. Here we go.
Absolutely.
Questions to ask therapists and agencies that provide services.
Sure. Okay. Now, this is part of trauma-informed care. If you forget everything I've said or Graham has said today, really, really important when we're talking to our therapists, when we have our kids that go to therapists, we want to know how these therapists work with our kids, what these therapists do, what types of modalities they utilize. We want to know, are you a qualified therapist to work with our kids? These are the important questions these therapists need to know and need to answer. It's okay to ask them. If their feelings get hurt, guess what? Get another therapist. You're not there to cater to their feelings. They're there to help your kids with their feelings. So the questions you need to be asking. Feel free to take pictures. Feel free to write them down if you have really fast handwriting. First one, do you provide trauma-specific or trauma-informed therapy? If so, how do you determine whether the person needs trauma-specific therapy? Okay, i.e., what types of therapeutic interventions do you utilize, and why would you utilize them for our kids? Next one, how familiar are you with evidence-based treatment models designed and tested for treatment of trauma-related symptoms? So, are you well-read on evidence-based treatment models? If so, which ones do you utilize? Next up, how do you approach therapy with individuals and their families who have been impacted by trauma? So, what does therapy look like in your office? What do you do? How do you do it? Why do you do it? When do you do it? Regardless of whether they indicate or request trauma-informed treatment. So if someone comes in and expresses their symptoms, expresses their histories, they don't necessarily have to say, hi, I'd like evidence-based trauma-informed care treatment. What do you provide? A therapist should be able to know, this is what's going on, this is what needs to be done. And then describe a typical course of therapy. As an example, can you describe the core components of your treatment approach? So when we come into your office from day one to discharge, what is your plan? What exactly would you like to see happen? What do you do? What models do you use? Why do you use them? What should we expect? If they're unable to answer these questions, I mean, obviously you're going to put them on the spot a little bit, so, give them a few minutes to gather their thoughts. But if they don't have a relatively okay answer for this, think about it. Yes?
So you're saying you asked the therapist this. Isn't there some kind of certification that they should present? Like other doctors would present, they're board certified?
Absolutely.
So there should be something that says they've had training for trauma.
Well, it just so happens that we've got some slides coming up.
I mean, that's what I would say if I was a doctor.
Sure. Well, you want to ask someone, do you practice, a trauma-informed approach, and do you use evidence-based trauma treatment? And with that, what types of certifications do you have? And
And we have 4 minutes.
we have 4 minutes, okay? What's that? I don't know if they are, but we have business cards up here, and I'd be happy to send them to you. So some good examples of evidence-based trauma-informed treatments. We have trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm going to throw in a quick plug for that. Every year, there is TFCBT training that is offered throughout the state. It's fantastic. It's a 2-day training, and it is wonderful for licensed therapists or those that are in the process of getting licensed. I would recommend it to anyone who is a licensed therapist or in the process of getting licensed. If you hear about the training, please, by all means, push your therapist to get that training. It's a fantastic model. addiction and trauma recovery integration model. And obviously, for the sake of time, I can't go through all of these, but if you have questions, you want to come up and ask about them afterwards. Risk-taking, TREM and MTREM is trauma recovery and empowerment model. MTREM was developed, believe it or not, this is going to surprise people, but the M stands for male because guys get traumatized as well. People didn't think about that when they originated the trauma recovery and empowerment model. There are also a bunch of different others, but we can go on to the next slide.
Yeah, whoops. And a great resource is the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, CEBC.org. SAMHSA has the National Registry for Evidence-Based Practices and Programs. They call it the NREPP through SAMHSA.
And these are a bunch of other models that are promising, that are being utilized throughout the country.
Okay. Well, we have about 2 minutes. I got 3:43.
I do as well. Our clocks are synced.
So real quickly, this work can impact you. So, you have to be really careful of developing compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, just based on the stories, the cases you hear about. It could be, the death of a child. You got to have a support system. Social support is literally a biological necessity. Have someone you trust, you can talk to, that can relate to you, because this work can it can disrupt your lives, your feelings, your personal relationships, and your view of the world. I'll be the first to tell you, 20 years in residential in the trenches, it affected me. Affected me tremendously in the way, I behaved in my own family. And it's very, very important we have the awareness of this. So I encourage everyone to have a self-care plan, put it in writing. Because this work can really impact you. So some of the sources, I mentioned a couple of these, investigating, death of a child, horrific injuries, et cetera, et cetera. So just being very aware of the impact that this work can have on you personally, and making sure we're aware of that and having that support system. So, these are some of the signs and symptoms, and of course this PowerPoint you can get, off the Guardment Litem site. We just want to say thank you for coming out today. We really and truly respect the work you do, and just really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.